Hello, Worcester Mennonite Church, and welcome to week 9 in a year of God's story of grace. In this week, we are going to be reflecting further on the story of the people of Israel coming out of Egypt and also about the story of Moses. Our theme is out of bondage and into freedom, and we'll be looking at Exodus chapters 7 through 12, as well as Psalm 78 and Psalm 105. And just as we get started, I'd like for us to contrast a little bit the theme in our passage related to the role of Pharaoh as the leader in Egypt and the role of Moses as the leader of the people of Israel. So just to start with Pharaoh for a little bit, Pharaoh, from an Egyptian perspective, was thought to be a child of Ra and thought to be of divine character and to preserve this cosmic order within the balance of the realm of Egypt by performing certain rituals as a king and as a intercessor on behalf of the people of Egypt. And so when the people looked at Pharaoh, they didn't just look at him as a ruler, but also as this almost divine figure who would intercede on their behalf, who would maintain order and harmony. And so, with that in mind, as we enter our passages for this week, and as we think of Moses coming before Pharaoh with this calling that we heard from last week to bring the message, to release the people of Israel, and God would affirm that message with various signs through Moses. So, as we think of that, we have to realize that there is a confrontation between the theology of the people of Egypt and what they thought Pharaoh embodied and the calling of Moses and what God is going to demonstrate through Moses, the God of Israel. And so in this clash, what is at stake is the Egyptian order of things and their sense of harmony and power and balance, and the disruption that God will bring as he brings his people out of Egypt. So it's in light of this that we will move to reflect on the plagues that God brings upon Egypt when Pharaoh refuses to let the people of Israel go. And I've heard before that these plagues were each related to different aspects of Egyptian life, as you know, perhaps within Egyptian thought, that actually they had a whole pantheon of Egyptian gods and they worshipped gods of different things. And so the Nile River in Egypt would have a deity connected with that, and they would have a deity connected with the sun, for example, and in all these different facets of life. And so I'd always heard before that the plagues of Egypt were directed at, in a way, in a sense, the different deities that the people of Egypt had. But I had never thought before this time, going through the scriptures, about how the plagues would also be directed at the whole Egyptian worldview of a sense of order and harmony. And as I was preparing for this video and just doing a little bit of reading, that in a way the plagues are kind of a reverse, if you will, of the creation story. When we think in the creation story of what God was doing in Genesis, bringing order out of chaos, it involved God separating the waters from the land. It involved God ordering the relationships between humanity and the animals and other created beings. It involved the ordering of the light and the darkness in the sky. And these plagues of Egypt are an act of almost decreation and an undoing of order and harmony, but in this sense, in the world of Egypt. So for those Egyptians who worship a god, quote unquote, of the Nile, the waters, God turned the waters into blood. And for those that look to the sky, the sky that would bring the rain, and they look to the sun and worshiped a quote unquote deity there, God would bring darkness. And, the created order that between human beings and the animal kingdom, God would disrupt that with the locusts and the other species that were invading Egyptians' homes. And so in all these ways, God was turning over and undoing the the order that Egyptians believed that they had in their world, and he was directly demonstrating that Pharaoh could not maintain this order and balance that they believed he could, but instead the God of Israel was the one who had ultimate power and authority. And for that reason, even more so, the people of Israel should be granted their freedom. And so as we continue to move through this story, ultimately it escalates to something even beyond the created order with the final plague, something so crucial that strikes so close to the heart of Egyptian society that it is crushing and tragic. And that is the death of the firstborn with the final plague, the very expression of the ending of life itself for dear beloved members of that Egyptian society. And that was the crushing final result of this path that Pharaoh continued to be on, where a plague would occur and he would appear to regret that he had not let the people of Israel go, but really he didn't want to endure the suffering caused by the plague. And so he'd act like, oh, okay, this time I'll let them go. And he wouldn't ultimately do that. And so then another plague would come and so forth and so on. But this final consummation of that path that he was on leads to this ultimate final end of suffering. And this is perhaps the great warning in the passage about those who are resisting and are hard-hearted and turn away again and again from what God is calling them to. And in this bigger sense, in this passage, it's about God's call to justice for the oppressors of his people to let them go. And it's kind of saying that that Pharaoh had multiple opportunities and God kept coming back and bringing attention and giving a chance and another opportunity. And Pharaoh kept hardening his heart. And then at certain points, Pharaoh would harden his heart and then God would harden Pharaoh's heart. And it becomes part of this interplay between Pharaoh's obstinance and then God's judgment. But anyway, it culminates in this tragic event. And so the judgment then that comes ultimately leads then to the release of the people of Israel. But there is a transition point here in the story. And what I'd like for us to think about now is moving from the plagues and the impact that they had on Egyptian society to the identity of the Israelites as they come out of Egypt. And one of the key moments that redefines them as a people is actually the Passover event. The final plague, as we know, was happening at a time when the people of Israel were told that to avoid being affected by this final plague, they were to kill a lamb and to celebrate a Passover meal, but then to mark the outer parts of their doorframe with the blood of the lamb as a sign that they had the covering and the protection of God as they were participating in this Passover. And then the firstborn in their families would be spared. And so what we see happening in this meal that they're given, this Passover meal, is this act of eating together and remembering God's saving power, and then marking their homes with the blood of the Lamb. They are becoming a people of worship, and God gives them this action of remembering, almost like a liturgy, something that would be carried not only in their generation, but for generations to come, that would point forward to the redemptive work of God, and it would remind the people that God is the one who acts on their behalf, and it would redefine them as a worshiping people. And their festivals, their calendars, the things that are to come in the life of Israel get redefined and oriented around this Passover meal, this first experience of deliverance from Egypt. And it really marks their identity as they leave Egypt behind. And it sets them off on this journey into the wilderness as a people who have been delivered a worshiping people and a people of remembrance. And then we'll see as they go into the desert that the people have come out of Egypt, but Egypt has not necessarily come out of the people. And what I mean by that is to say that their memories, their mindsets, the rhythms and aspects of life when they were slaves in Egypt are things that accompany them into the wilderness. And whenever they encounter hardship, they are tempted to remember and reflect back on how life had been in Egypt. And at times, they start to grumble and complain. And as bad as it was, they at certain times long for former things that they had, even though they were in slavery. And that is a great sadness and struggle of, of this first generation of people coming out of Egypt. And we see that highlighted in our first psalm reading. I mentioned it earlier. It's Psalm 78. And really, that psalm highlights the story of the people of Israel coming out of Egypt from the lens of their own struggles and failures. And it shows how it really was hard for them to let go of their life in Egypt. And really, that whole first generation of Israelites will end up dying out before their whole people end up settling in the land of Canaan, in the land of promise, as they spend 40 years in the desert in this time of transition before the promised land. But interestingly, to draw this to a close, the final psalm that we have, Psalm 105, is the counterpoint to the people's unfaithfulness or the struggle on their part to let go of Egypt. And that is the story of God's faithfulness, that the God who delivered them from Egypt accompanies them in the desert. He remembers his promises to their ancestors, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's faithful and brings them through and continues working on their behalf and delivering them. And so, because God is so faithful, that becomes the source of hope for the people of Israel time and time again. And that is really the reason for celebration in Psalm 105. So I hope as we conclude week 9, that maybe we could all reflect about our own journeys and maybe the obstinance that we might have at times in our own hearts to change. What are we holding on to? Maybe sinful patterns or behaviors or mindsets that are not helpful, but really hinder us and hold us back from a sense of freedom and a trust in God. And then how can we find hope that we can overcome those things or be delivered from those struggles through the faithfulness and the grace of God and the provision of God? Just like hadn't mentioned it yet, but just like God provided manna in the desert, a daily provision, so too can he provide a daily provision for us. So I want to thank you again for joining me for this week's set of readings, and thank you again for coming along on this journey as we go through God's Word together. May God bless you richly, and until next time, goodbye.